it works perfectly, and we can still hear you. Emilie, can you say something?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon.
Excellent, and it works. So, good afternoon, everyone. Second workshop and final workshop today, in parallel with the other and the colleagues. Thank you so much, Emilie, for being available, for being with us today. So, we're going to talk about labeling sustainability. My name is Mauro Scalia. I'm director for the Sustainable Department Businesses in EURATEX. I'm here with Emilie from Quantis, and the job of today is basically to talk about product environmental footprint and to ask questions and to make comments in a very open way, very open and civilized way, no matter how sensitive the subject might be for any of us. So just a little bit of a context here. We have heard a lot actually about defining sustainability and labeling sustainability already this morning. Some of us might understand labeling sustainability as a concept, an information you put on a label. Now, we have also discussed this morning that there is a long highway to get there, made of life cycle assessment, PEF, product environmental footprint category rules, green claims. We discussed this a lot this morning. So the labeling is really like the last mile. There is a lot of efforts and a lot of work to be done before that to be able to define what is a sustainable product. Mm-hmm. So the opportunity we want to take today with you, and also thanks to the availability of Emilie, is to really get you an insight from the technical perspective and in general on how this PEF work is proceeding. Why do we need it? What is going to deliver to us and to the companies? And also listen, what are your thoughts on this point? Still perhaps a few insights, because Emilie was not with us this morning. We heard about, for instance, that if you work with Volvo car manufacturers, when you make your LCA, you cannot consider nuclear energy. If you work for another car manufacturer, you can consider nuclear energy. I think this was a nice example of how there are different LCAs, and you might have different results based on which LCA you choose. We also heard Robert say that, again, quoting the automotive value chain, I don't know how much, but we talk a lot about the car industry this morning. They have one system, they are ready. And then he asked, why don't we have one ISO system instead of different system? So it is clear that we need harmonization if we want to be able to speak the same language. And in that sense, legislation is coming in support or in action, in any case, on that sense. Within 1 month from now, approximately, by the 30th of November, we expect the Green Claim Initiative to be published by the Commission. It will be a legislative action which will try, again, to prevent greenwashing and to help us out in defining what is a sustainable product. In that work, the legislation will define minimum criteria for what could be a sustainability claim, and it will take into account the product environmental footprint, what we're going to discuss here today. And just as a final word on that, I think 1 month ago, perhaps some of you have heard, a few brands have been fined in the Netherlands because they have made sustainability claims, and according to the authorities in the Netherlands, that was not substantiated, it was not transparent enough, it was not clear on what those claims was based. So it is clear that we have a need to avoid situations like this one. We all agreed we need to avoid greenwashing, and we need to find and agree on a methodology to define what is a sustainable product and to compare products. EURATEX has a very clear position on that we're also going to publish soon. And that is, we do need a harmonized way in Europe to define what is a sustainable product. We need one harmonized way to do that. We also part of the work ongoing, on which Emilie in a moment is going to talk us through, and we call for improvements because we know it's a technically difficult process, but we need to work together to find the right solution. This is very simply, in a very highlight, how do we stand on that? And once again, handing over to Emilie, I first of all, again, thanks Quantis for the availability. I stress it is an opportunity for us to learn, to go through the different points. Emilie has been working on life cycle assessment already before. She also worked with public authorities as far as in Australia, as you might have read in the bio on the profile. So I think she's the perfect person to help us going through the complexity and the high-level result available at this stage. So without any further ado, Emilie, I would hand it over to you, if you please, and then we're going to have at least half an hour of time for us to discuss the points that you have raised. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mauro. Hi, everyone. Apologies for not being here in person, but I hope we can bring a bit of context for a good conversation, although half remotely. So just a very quick word about Quantis. We are a global organization where we're based in 6 countries, and we've been working on life cycle assessment for about 15 years. And what we do is we try to work on 3 key sectors. Apparel and sporting goods is one, and we have food and beverage as well as cosmetics, so looking at consumer goods. Because what we're really trying to do here is to encourage companies to change in a really measurable and science-based way, and to really enable these business transformations. So I think you've heard a bit about LCA today, but the PEF vision is really that if you picture that we're in 2030, which is really just around the corner now, you can walk in your usual retail store, the one that you like, and this time you can see that every brand has been able to calculate the footprint of their product because they've all used a simple, scalable, and universal method to do so. That's the goal. But before we go any further, I just wanted to go through a bit of a, I guess, vocab point. There are a lot of terms being thrown around, and I just want to make sure that we all speak the same language as much as possible. So at the top of this slide, you've got the method, which was developed by the European Commission. It's called Product Environmental Footprint. There is an organization environmental footprint method as well, which is the sister method of this one. And it is a very high-level modeling rules, which can be applied across to any sector. It covers 16 impact categories, including carbon, but also, for example, some water or toxicity or resource use indicators as well. And it contains a number of rules around data requirements, for example, having to use a specific database, and a really stringent verification process. Because this applies across to any sector, it's quite generic. To make it a bit more comparable and easier, I guess, for different companies operating in the same sector, you can go to the next level and develop what's called product environmental footprint category rules. Here, what this means is that we're actually complementing the PEF methodology by shifting the focus to what really matters in that industry. There's a few of them out there already. There's the PEFCR for dairy, for example, or there's a shadow one for cosmetics, so not an official one, or packed water. We need PEFCRs on speakers and how to work remotely. So yes, for example, in the apparel and footwear PEFCRs, we're actually looking at 13 subcategories. And that includes, for example, t-shirts or 3 categories for footwear. And so when you want to make a product-specific study, then you're able to take the apparel and footwear PEFCRs and do a PEF study on a hiking boot, or a PEF study of a t-shirt, or a PEF study of a sweater, using the same rules. Now, there are cases where there's no sector-specific rules, no PEFCRs, and you're still able to do a PEF study using directly the PEF method, but it's not going to be as straightforward for you to do so. So I just wanted to really lay down the 3 different layers. There's the PEF method, which is really overarching, the PEFCRs, which are really sector-specific, and a PEF study, which would be product-specific. Now, so PEF is the environmental footprinting done the EU way. The method was developed in around 2010, and in 2013, the European Commission published its first method, together the PEF and the OEF method. It was then tested for 5 years on 26 different products, and then they tweaked it in 2019, and now we're part of this transition phase, which is testing the new version again. So we've been working on this methodology for a few years already. I've just heard from Mauro's intro that you've spoken about LCA this morning, but just as a bit of a reminder, we're looking at the full life cycle of products here. So starting from the raw materials through to manufacturing, distribution, use, and end of life, which may or may not include recycling. And then we'll be looking at a number of different indicators, so not just the carbon footprint, but also water, ecosystems quality, natural resources, or human health. Now, if we dive a bit further in the PEFCR project, so the first thing that's probably of interest is that when you're working on sectorial rules, there's a requirement from the European Commission that you've got a good representation of the market. So you can't just say, you know, I'm Emilie and I'm just going to start writing rules for scooters on my own. So in our case, we launched the Secretariat in late 2019. And we're grouping a bunch of different voting and non-voting members. So you can see here we've got a few brands, but we've also got some trade associations like EURATEX representing some materials. So for example, we've got leather, cotton, or wool. And we've also got 2 NGOs. So we've got ECOS and we've got the European Environmental Bureau. And we also have a couple of, I guess, governments. So we've got the French government through ADEME. And the European Commission is also an observer in this work. Quantis is the technical expert on the work, and we've been working together with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition to lead the Secretariat. Now, I just wanted to talk through, I guess, the process of designing product category rules. Like whenever you talk about life cycle assessment, I guess the approach is to try and be iterative. So we're going to start by doing something that's quite simple, and then we're going to refine it and make it more complex. So here you've got the global project steps. So first we had to define the scope. What are we actually looking at? So we said apparel and footwear. Okay, that includes a number of things. How can we get subcategories that make sense? How can we define what's called the functional unit? So what we're going to be looking at, is it one t-shirt? Is it one t-shirt worn one time? Is it a t-shirt along its entire life? Which is what we went with. Then we have to define what's called representative products per subcategory. And that would be, for example, creating an average t-shirt, which we're going to be studying. This is a bit of a Frankenstein product. It's not a real product. It's based on the average data. So for example, how much, how many cotton t-shirts are we selling in Europe? How many polyester t-shirts? How many wool t-shirts? And then you create a representative product out of it. Based on that, you do a first RP study, representative product study, which is a way of drafting calculation rules and testing them at the same time. Then we had a first public consultation. And then afterwards, we made a few changes based on the public comments that were made to the category rules. The next step is really important, and that's what's called the supporting studies. And that's to test the rules on real products. Because again, it's one thing to test products on average, to test the rules, on average products, but it doesn't really tell you much about how real products would be able to do the calculation. So here you'd be testing, the requirements for primary data, if the calculation rules are clear or if there are gaps or things that weren't written well. And you would also look at the results to see if the representative product results, which we're going to use as benchmarks, make sense. Afterwards, you go through a few more loops. There will be another public consultation, and there will be a number of reviews by a panel of experts, an independent panel of experts. This takes time. It's meant to be a 2-year process. Because we're working with the European Commission, it always takes longer. I'm sure if you worked with them, that's going to be your experience as well. But the idea is really that it's a transparent process and that there's 2 opportunities through the public consult for companies who haven't been involved in the technical secretariat to come in and share their thoughts. In terms of the project timeline, so as mentioned, we started late in 2019 with the project kickoff, and we had the first public consultation in 2021, which went together with the first expert panel review. We received what's considered a lot of comments at the time, so over 1,000 comments. And we are currently in the middle of the supporting studies where we're testing the rules on real products. And following this reporting studies, we'll publish a new version to take the feedback into account, and there will be another public consultation, hopefully in Q3 2023. The end of the project is planned for Q3/Q4 2024 at the moment. The reason there's a lot of stars here is because we're waiting on data from the European Commission. So we have to use a certain database, which makes secondary data available for free, which is going to come together with the calculation rules so that anyone who wants to use the calculation rules can use the database for free, and everybody will be using the same data. But unfortunately, there's been some delays in the development of the data sets as well. So that's the high-level presentation. I didn't want to take too much time, just so we would have a bit more time for the Q&A.
I think that's perfect. So I guess we can already start with a set of questions. I myself took some notes on the points that, some of the points you mentioned. But please, the floor is open to all of you. Who would like to break the ice? Question, comments? Please, just wait until you receive a microphone, because otherwise, Emilie, she cannot hear you. And maybe you could also introduce yourself.
Sorry, Sarah Kent from Business of Fashion. I was just wondering if you could clarify how the PEF fits in with green claims policy, which from my understanding is separate but related, and what the timeline for green claims could be and how that intersects with PEF.
Sure. As you know, this is in the hands of the European Commission. As Mauro mentioned, there is a draft that is expected end of November, but it's been postponed, I don't even know how many times now, at least a year and a half. So we're, keeping our fingers crossed that it will come out end of November. What we, I guess, have heard is that in the Green Claims Initiative, there will be requests for substantiation of green claims. And particularly when it comes to, I guess, footprint claims. So if you say the carbon footprint of my product is X, or even if you were to say my product has a better footprint than products Y, then the expectation is that you would have to substantiate this claim using LCA. It could be that the LCA method that you're using is PEF, but it could be that it's just another LCA approach. So this is still to be, I guess, clarified by the European Commission in their draft, which direction they're going to pick, if it's going to be PEF exclusively or if it's going to be another method. In terms of timelines, I suspect that it will take a bit of time for this to be put in place. And also, I should mention another regulatory draft, which is probably going to look at PEF as maybe as some background information, I would say, which is the eco-design regulation, so ESPR. This draft came out in March, and there will be delegated acts on textile, among other, I guess, topics. And they opened the door, the regulation opened the door to a number of requirements to be able to enter the EU market. Some of them are related to the product passport, which I think you've discussed in this conference as well. And it could be that they're asking for some environmental information to be shared. And it could be that they are linked to PEF. But this is all very, very open at this stage. And again, I wouldn't expect anything too drastic too soon, just because it takes time for companies to wrap their heads around these type of calculations as well.
Thank you, Emilie. There was, I think, another question from the center. Please.
Hello, Hugo from Adalberto. One question. One of the things that you said that we can make the LSCA and use the LSCA to verify or support some information that we can put in our storytelling information for end client. But if you try to make the comparison, if you are good or bad compared with in terms of consumption of water, energy in our process, who gonna be done this database, or how it's gonna be done?
Yeah, I think like, to be fully transparent with you, I'm a big supporter of PEF, and I'll stop sharing so I can see the room a bit better. I'm a big supporter of the PEF approach because it is making things somehow easier. So if you've got calculation rules for a sector and everybody follows the calculation rules, then you're kind of making your life easier in a sense. So for example, you could design a tool that would be using these rules, and then the only thing you'd have to do is to put in your primary data and verify the primary data to know that your claim was substantiated. If you are going for another approach, that means you would have to verify everything. So you'd have to verify how your calculation was made on top of the primary data that you'd be using. And then if you're making comparisons, that means you have to make sure that the calculations were done the same way for these two products. When I talk to my friends about my job, which I do quite a bit, I always take this example of milk. And I guess that's, you talked about cars this morning. So if I take milk A and the milk producer decides to include 50% of the impact of the cow, because they say, okay, the cow is used for the milk, but it's also used for leather. It's also used for meat. It's also used for feed. So I think I can just take 50% of the impact of the cow when I calculate the footprint of my milk. But then producer B says, the reason the cow is kept alive is for the milk. Otherwise, we could probably kill it a bit earlier. So I'm going to take 70% of the impact of the cow in my calculation. Well, you can see straight away that the difference of footprint is going to be favorable to milk A because they're only using 50% of the cow, not 70% of the cow. So you wouldn't be able to make a fair comparison between milk A and milk B. But then again, if you are saying for every milk, you have to use 70% of the impact of the cow, then that's one thing you don't need to check. Everybody's using 70%. You can include that in the tool, and then it makes it easier to not look at things every time, but maybe just once. I don't know if that answers your question. You could be using other methodologies. There are requirements from ISO standards when you make comparative claims that you need a third-party review, and that third party will verify, that you've followed the same rules and that you've used the same assumptions and that you're not favoring your product over the other product in your calculations.
One question maybe, Emilie, on one of the things you said before, you went in September for a public consultation and you had more than 1,000 comments. And then based on that, the PAF draft was changed. Can you give us a little bit of a sense how you process these comments and what kind of change you expect taking place in the next consultation and in the previous consultation?
Yep. So obviously a lot of the comments that were made regarded some of the trickiest bits, I would say, that we're trying to handle in this work. One thing that we're doing here is we're looking at the footprint of the products per use. So the reason we've decided to choose this functional unit is because if you make a really, really flimsy t-shirt, I would say, with very few grams of fabric, if you're just looking at the production itself, it's going to come out better than a product that is made of a more robust fabric, for example, because you're using less materials, it's lighter, and if you're just looking at production, it will come out with a lower footprint. Integrating what we've called durability, physical durability, is a way to say, okay, that t-shirt is using less fabric, but if you're only able to wear it 5 times before having to throw it away, whereas with the other t-shirt, you're able to wear it, I don't know, 20 times before throwing it away. I'm hoping that it's more than that, but just giving an example. Then you would be able to demonstrate, including the use phase, that although you're spending more in terms of footprint in the production stage, you're going to need to replace that t-shirt less often. So in the long run, per use, you will have a lower footprint. So a lot of the comments that we've received were actually about how you define these numbers. How do you know that something is going to be able to be worn 5 times or 20 times or 100 times? And this is one of the trickiest things to do because there is no test, no clear test where you can use this t-shirt and say, I'm going to be able to wear it another 20 times. So we've tried to come up with a bit of a proxy. We've used a number of tests. They depend on the type of product. Obviously, you can't use the same test on a t-shirt and a pair of shoes, but they're not perfect. So we are very, very open in receiving comments from as many people as possible, really, on what these tests should be and how to make sure they're not insanely expensive as well, because this is the other issue, that you could test products a million times, but then it wouldn't be worth it. So what we did, I guess, when we received a lot of these comments is some comments were easy to answer. A lot of them were about, understanding the methodology or understanding what we could do. So we just answered them straight away. But then some comments, like the durability comments, we compiled and we put forward to the technical secretariat saying, okay, well, people have suggested this new test might be a good option. Or they've suggested, for example, that the current product categories we've got aren't narrow enough. For example, we're putting all t-shirts together. Maybe it would make sense to have 3 types of t-shirts. And so we're refining the methodology and we're testing it in the supporting studies to see what we can change. With the second public consultation, I'm expecting something quite similar. And I guess we will have been a bit further down the road in terms of the questions that we can already answer. So we're hoping that some of the comments that we get, we'll be able to say, yep, we've worked on this now, we've addressed this, and this is how we've addressed this. The reality is there will still be things that are out of our control as a technical secretariat. So one example is the inclusion of microplastics or microfibers in the methodology. We know this is an issue that is really important in the apparel and footwear sector. Unfortunately, the PEF method doesn't include the impact of microplastics. The reason it doesn't is because life cycle assessment is a science-based method and it takes time to refine these models and to make sure that they work. So there's a lot of research happening. Quantis is actually involved in a couple of EU projects trying to figure out how we do this. And once the method will be ready, it will be integrated. But in the meantime, it's not integrated. And we can't include that and still be PEF compliant, which is what we have to do because we work with the European Commission. So unfortunately, if these questions come up again, and I've got no doubt that they will, we will be able to still say, sorry, we know it's important. We can't include it in the calculation itself. We are trying to find a way to include it as a note separately to the actual calculation of the PEF score. But we may still not be able to give a good answer by then.
Thank you for clarifying. I think this is a sensitive point. Some of us have already mentioned this earlier also this morning, and I think the answer is clear. There is a willingness also to expand the range of items the PEF looks at, but for that you need science-based methods and proof tests that at this point in time they are not yet available. So I think that's a very good point. Other question from the floor, please. I have one question here and then one question in the middle. The other way around.
Sorry, okay. Thank you. This is Tuba from the Turkish Textile Employers Association. Maybe it is related to what you just explained, but lately we have been exposed to a discussion or a concern from a certain type of fiber manufacturers that the PEF category rules in the making may be biased towards some kind of fibers than the others, that they are favoring some kind of fibers than the others, the classical ancient, let's say, fight between natural and man-made fibers. What can you say to comfort the industry that the PEF rules at the end will be, fair to all of the industry? What can I tell my members when I go back home? Thank you.
That's a really good question, and obviously this debate has been going on for quite some time. What I would say is that there is a point, because it is related to the microplastics issue. Currently, we're not evaluating the impact of microplastics or microfibers, actually, because there is an impact from other microfibers as well. And so that is mostly detrimental to natural fibers versus synthetic fibers. But I would say this is the only point, and it is a fair one, where the method is a bit biased. But otherwise, the method is really looking at it's a really holistic approach, I would say, that is looking at, the extraction of fossil fuels and some of the benefits of natural fibers as well, such as the biodegradability of these fibers through composting, for example, at their end of life. There is also a specific indicator, which is called fossil resources, that looks at the fact that these resources are not unlimited, that they're not renewable. And so natural fibers would score better on those than synthetic fibers. So it is, to me, the only one caveat I would say at this stage is the microplastics issue, which we're really working on. But otherwise, I would say the method is pretty balanced. And the other aspect, I guess, that we are looking at is some of the properties of these different fibers as well, because we know that we are buying, for example, I buy a lot of merino, actually, because I exercise a lot, and I just think that these garments just suit me better when I exercise, for example. So I think that's the other thing that people have to take into account, that we're not just I guess ignoring the properties of these different fibers as well, and that in the method itself there are, I guess, different durability tests, how often you wash things. So, for example, you don't wash wool as often as you would synthetics in terms of sportswear, just because it doesn't react the same way, I guess. So all of this we're trying to take into account as much as possible. For example, in how often you need to wash it or how long it's gonna live. So we are trying to paint a fair picture, I would say, and we're always welcoming any comment that could help, I guess, balance the method a bit better.
And I think I also thanks Tuba for this question, because we know it's a very, very much debated topic in our membership. As Emilie explained, we also, as EURATEX, part of this. And obviously, being the European Textile Apparel Industry Federation, we are neutral when it comes to any fiber. So it is also a point of our interest to ensure that whatever assessment is made is neutral when it comes to the different type of fibers. And I can also say, without entering details, that I can definitely see how colleagues representing other fibers or other type of garments are actually very active and very vocal in all the debate that take place inside the technical secretariat. So when it comes to contribution, and I think Emilie can only confirm that, also the colleagues from other parts of the value chain are extremely active. They do provide a lot of inputs when it comes about technical requirements, or even more recently about communication, for instance. Perhaps also, Emilie, maybe you can also say something about that later. So I think the debate is definitely active, not only within the EURATEX membership, but also inside the technical secretariat. And I think I have two more questions, one in the front and then one at the bottom, please.
Hi, Emilie. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. This is Andrea from Sustainable Brand Platform. So we developed a software for the fashion industry to provide several, to acquire and manage sustainability data. Among the toolkit we provide, one is the product LCA calculation. So I actually have two questions. The first one is regarding the data set. So using secondary data, how do you think this data set, how reliable it is, and if you see in the future a transition to using primary data instead of secondary data? So how, if you see it, how will it happen, and how important will it be? And the second question is then regarding, you said like the PEF methodology, you're a fan of it. How if you have an opinion, like pro and cons regarding other methodologies such as EPD, for example. So yeah, thanks.
Sure. Thank you for your question. So yeah, we haven't spoken about data yet. So the PEF method, and that's one of the things I really like about it, is recommending what they call a materiality approach. So okay, you could use fully primary data for your calculation. That would be an option. It would be probably quite difficult for you to find all the relevant primary data. And, I'm saying maybe, but I know it because we are LCA consultants, so I can tell you it is difficult to find primary data for everything. And what the PEF method is saying is that this is not necessarily worth it. So they've got a couple of rules there about if you can identify, I guess, the parts of the life cycle where it is important for you to collect primary data. And this is what the PEF-CR is doing, really. So when we've calculated the footprint of our representative products, we identified, and it is quite common for the apparel industry, that the most relevant parts of the life cycle were the raw materials, so the type of materials you're using, the manufacturing, and the use phase. We do know that unless you're doing air cargo, distribution is actually not as relevant as the other two, and that end of life is also not as relevant. Now, whenever we're looking at sourcing primary data, for the use phase, this is outside of the hands of manufacturers. You can say, you can have care instructions on your garment. We all know people don't really follow care instructions. I don't follow care instructions. I always wash at 30, for example. And so what we've decided to do in the PEF-CR is to say, okay, well, here's a list of the primary data that you absolutely need. If you don't have access to that, you can't say that you're compliant with the PEF-CR. And this includes things like the bill of material itself. It includes the provenance of these materials as well, whenever possible. We're not asking for farm level data, for example, for your cotton, but we are asking for us to know the type of cotton that it is, so where it's coming from, if it's been treated with any, for example, finishing, and there will be questions around the manufacturing processes as well. So, for example, are you using weaving or knitting? What type of dyeing are you using, or other types of treatments as well? And then we are providing assumptions for the distribution, and there will be secondary data sets from the EF database as well for the distribution. Similarly, for the use phase, we've decided to standardize use scenarios, and there are, again, the durability options to say, for example, my default lifetime is actually longer because my garment is more durable. And again, we've got some standard end-of-life scenarios and end-of-life data sets. So here we've tried to say what really matters, plus is accessible, I guess, to companies, is what you need primary data for. Everything else you can use secondary data. We are testing these rules right now in the supporting studies, because it's one thing to say everything is accessible and it's easy. So one example is dead stock. We're asking for primary data for dead stock. We're asking for primary data for losses during production as well. Because we think this is, we know this is going to be important in terms of impact, and we think it should be accessible. We are going to be testing if it's just too hard for companies to find it now or not, before we make our final recommendations. Now, that was the first half of your first question. The second half was the quality of the data. This is the biggest issue with the use of secondary data. Creating data sets is a very tedious and expensive process, and data sets need to be updated on a regular basis because processes change, because the electricity grid changes, even just that, even if the rest of the process doesn't change, the impact will change because the electricity mix of the country where you're manufacturing changes. And we know that there is just not enough data out there. There are, I guess, a number of proxies that we have to use when we don't have the right data set. And as soon as you start doing that, your quality level just goes down. This is why we always call for trade associations to work together on creating data, because trade associations are best placed. They've got access to representative manufacturers, representative data really, and they can collectively decide to develop better quality data sets as well. Where it's going, I would say for me, I would really recommend against going for full primary data for everything, because I think, I mean, currently, maybe in 30 years, who knows, but currently you would be spending a lot of time for something that is not that impactful. So I would rather spend time/money refining what matters than spending time getting primary data for things that ultimately will not matter that much. So for example, if we're looking at the impact of the end of life stage compared to the raw material stage, sure, you could collect primary data for your end of life. You could put tags in your garments and know where they're thrown away, for example. But I think that would be almost a useless investment, because I would much rather have really good primary data for the raw materials and the manufacturing stage. The pros and cons of other methodologies. Sorry, I'm blanking now. If it was the
EPD.
Oh, EPDs, yes, sorry, that was the one. Yeah, so I think any standardization is good. If you when the PEF method was tested in the pilot phase between 2013 and 2018, the construction industry actually participated in the test of the PEF method, and actually I was leading a pilot project for the paint industry at the time, pre-Quantis days for me. And so the idea was to say, would we be able to use the PEF approach instead of the EPD approach in the construction sector as well? And ultimately, the construction sector decided to stick to EPDs. I think I would say any standardization is good because it will help you scale up. It will make things more comparable and it will make things cheaper. And that's what the PEF method is trying to do. But in the case of the construction industry, I think there was such an uptake of EPDs pre-PEF that it was almost too big of a cultural shift for them to actually embrace the PEF. And I think the Commission is probably going to recognize that as well. And, you know, if we come back to the first question, which was about substantiating green claims, I'm sure they will allow substantiation of claims using EPDs and that ISO standard instead. So I would say it almost just depends on what your industry is considering best practice, as long as there is standardization, as long as things are done in a harmonized way. And in a modular way as well, because obviously if you decide that half of the industry is going with PEF and the other half is going with EPDs, then you will never be able to build the full, you know, building blocks. So the fact that the entire construction industry is sticking to EPDs, you know, from I don't know, bricks to insulation materials to paint makes sense, because you want to really be in that holistic environment. Otherwise, as long as you're kind of compliant with some sort of standard, I think that is recognized by the industry, to me, you know, they still make sense.
Emilie, if I can build up on that before I hand it over, you say something extremely interesting and important for us, data which are accessible to the companies. And thinking about the fact that we're going indeed towards a digital product passport, so we're going towards a level of traceability in the value chain that should make data more accessible throughout the value chain. What do you think could be the impact of the capacity of a company to provide data in its total scoring or in its total result in PEF? And did the supporting study at this stage, were they able to tell us something, to give us some insights of what is going to be the role of information in actually using on the ground the methodology?
Thanks, Mauro. That's a really good question. So as I mentioned, I think we've listed primary data requirements based on, you know, what we think is potentially accessible. Now, we know that in reality, it's very different when you're looking for information for one product versus when you're starting to look for information for all of your products. This is a very different ordeal, and particularly for SMEs, this can be really, really tricky. So what we are doing with the supporting studies is there's actually two batches of supporting studies. There's the official one, and that is 39 studies, 3 for each product category. And they're mostly done by bigger brands, but we have included a few SMEs as well, just to try and be able to test that scalability. The second part is the unofficial supporting studies, which have been run by the French government. So you might have discussed this already, but in France, they are looking at labeling of products big scale, maybe mandatory, not entirely sure at this stage. The law says it is, but we're still waiting for the application décret, I don't know how you call that, but that law that will make it real. They are really, really like they can't impose something to every company without assessing how much it's going to cost. That is just not an option. So what they've decided to do is they've sponsored 90 additional supporting studies, so 2.5 times what we will be doing officially, with SMEs particularly, to try and see how difficult these data points are to collect. Now, I did want to clarify, we are not asking for measurement of data points to be in place. So you can replace your electricity from your secondary data sets if you want to, but we're not asking for meters in every factory or any of this. But again, sometimes asking for even just the provenance of some materials can be very difficult to find. So what I'm really looking forward to is the results of the supporting studies, both official and unofficial, to be able to tell us this data point was not accessible. We thought it was, but considering how long it took us for one product, it's not scalable. And then what we will do is that we will amend the primary data requirements of the PEFCR based on that. And we will most likely make a note to still say, this is a very relevant data point. We couldn't include it now because it's too difficult to access, but please, in the next version of the PEFCRs, because these documents are meant to be valid for only 5 years, or 5 years, I would say, then maybe in 5 years, something has shifted because there have been, I don't know, transparency requirements, maybe from a regulatory body somewhere, and then the data has become available. And so by all means, include it in the next version. But we want to remain, I guess, reasonable in terms of what we ask for, not to make it impossible to comply with.
And this study will be done by when, more or less, the French and the official one?
We should be getting the results in Q1 2023. We're still waiting on the database to be able to do the calculations. But the database should be available in December now. So yeah, Q1 next year.
Thank you. There was a question from Frederick by the door over there.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Frederick. I'm representing the European Man-Made Fibers Association. I don't know if this forum is the best to ask this question, but the issue was raised several times. So we represent the man-made fibers, meaning cellulosic and also synthetic. So, of course, in future, there will be more recycling, there will be more natural fibers used as well, probably, but certainly more cellulosic fibers. But there is a lot of discussions about microplastics. Well, we all know that. Now, one thing we have to know is that synthetic fibers are more durable, and that is also why the PEF is actually probably better for them up to a certain extent. Maybe this is also for you to to confirm this. But on the other hand, of course, there is more and more bio-based synthetic fibers, and there is more and more biodegradable synthetic fibers. And this is starting now, and I think this is also going to become important in future. But just to underline that, as Mauro said it before, I mean, every fiber has its place in the fiber world, and it would not even be possible to replace all synthetic fibers because of this big fiber request. And just as a small remark, when you see the oil that is being used, 2/3 to 3/4 of that is being burned, and 1%, just 1% goes into synthetic fibers. Thank you. More a remark than a question.
Yes, I don't know if, Emilie, you have anything to add. You already touched upon extensively on the microplastic point. Any other comment you would like to make on these questions?
The only comment I would like to make is I guess on the innovation side of things. So because we're not asking for primary data for any of these materials, we need to rely on, I guess, the EF database. And we have asked for a large number, actually, of raw materials and processes to be included in the EF database. But this is where, again, I would like to encourage people to develop data sets for more innovative materials as well. So for example, if you want to be able to put forward the fact that you're using some innovative fiber, like the biodegradable synthetic fibers that you were just talking about, I think it's really important that we enable people to make calculations when they start using these fibers so that they can show the benefits from them as well. So maybe more of a remark as well, but just to encourage people to really collect the data on all of these types of fibers so that we can, we can play around with a toolkit and see what works best.
We have two more questions. One over there, please.
Hi, it's Otakar from Mileta. We are a producer of cotton fabrics. We had a session on digital passport here 1 hour back, and maybe I'm the only one, but I'm a little bit confused about the relation between PEF and digital passport. So I think they are supporting each other, I hope. I see there is a kind of time sequence, but if you can describe in a better way how they are linked or they are not linked, what we can expect as companies, and then maybe a simplified picture. In 10 years from now, I will have a shirt in the store and we know that there will be some digital passport information. Do I have the PEF information as well on second label, or it will be incorporated together? I'm a little bit lost, so please try to help me.
Yes, sorry, it kind of cut off, but you can hear me still, yeah? I think this is a bit of a question for the crystal ball, and I don't work for the commission, so I can't fully tell you what's going to happen. So I think the product passport will include some environmental information. I don't think we could really not include any environmental information on there just because consumers just would not take it. I think this is, in 2022 and time for the passport itself to be in place, maybe 2024, we just will need to have some environmental information. The question for me is more, is this going to be PEF information or not? I would say short term, I personally doubt it, just because it takes a lot of work to be able to scale up this type of calculations. And France is looking at implementing some, large scale labeling already, but I think they will be ahead of the EU maybe for 10 years. However, if the French experiment goes well, then I think that would be a big push for the EU to implement that at a broader scale as well. So the question for me is more, what type of other information could we share? And maybe we will start with something about maybe microplastics, or maybe just even the origin of the different fabrics that are in there. This type of information I would see happening, I guess, before any PEF labeling happens. But again, I don't work for the commission, so this is a bit of a crystal ball answer at my end.
I would tend to agree with that. The interesting thing is that the development of the digital product passport on the ESPR, on the eco-design requirements and PEF are happening almost at the same time. So from our standpoint, there has to be a consideration of what we know and what are the limits of one when the other one is being developed. Clearly, anything which would be transferred along the value chain through the digital product passport should also enable to comply with the requirements you will have in eco-design or the information you have to exchange for due diligence or for PEF. So this is why we are looking at all these pieces of legislation at the same time and make sure that once what is asked in one can be also supported by the others. And I think we should get the last round of the question. We have one over there and another one over there, and then we should try to wrap up. Please.
Should I start first? Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, this is Shahryar from Spinnova, Finland. I have actually a very straightforward question. You are getting the secondary data or using the secondary data. For the fiber, which is the data source, I'm asking because as we also producing and we are expecting a lot of textiles and garments will be made out of Spinnova fiber. So where that will be, I mean, where we are going to submit our data.
So the EF database is a database that's managed by the European Commission. What they do is they tender the development of data sets to consultancies like Quantis, actually. We're not a big data provider, or other data providers which are bigger would be EcoInvent. They're based in Switzerland, or Sfera. They're based in, well, everywhere, but initially Germany. And depending on the type of fiber, the consultants usually look at either literature, existing literature, or they will go and do data collection. So for example, if you work with the cotton industry, then you might be able to access farm data and build data sets. Now, the process of integrating data sets to the EF database is currently, I would say, not really streamlined, but again, it's kind of what you expect when you work with the Commission. They are, however, looking at a way of making it easier for the integration of new data sets or innovative materials or maintenance, and for the financing as well of these data sets, because as I mentioned earlier, they're quite expensive. And hopefully they will be working on that in the next couple of years, so that in a few years we get a better process. In the short term, what I would say, if you've got data that you'd like to submit, is that you can contact the European Commission directly. There will be a review process to make sure that the data that is integrated is of a sufficient quality. And that means an estimation of the technological representativity, the geographical representativity, the age, and yeah, I guess these would be the key parameters as well. But yeah, I would recommend contacting the European Commission and specifying that there are data sets that you'd like to see shared with a broader group of people.
So what we hear from you is that there is openness to integrate data set in the methodologies, whether it could be about, I don't know, the SIP value chain or new fiber or other elements. There is a possibility, actually even have encouraged industry association to support the provision of data. So that's, I think it's also a very good point. I think we have the last question. Sarah, please, over there.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on the point you made at the beginning, Mauro, about what other or regulators outside the European Commission itself are doing. You mentioned certain companies getting fined, but in Norway, there's also been a ruling against the use of the SAC's Higg index in product labels, which is probably the biggest example we've had to date of brands attempting to use LCA-based information in a similar way that the PEF would require. How is that influencing discussions at a PEF level, and what does that decision in Norway mean for this sort of bigger EU level discussion?
We could not have missed this elephant in the room. I think now we touch upon all the elephants in the room. So thank you for calling for the last one. Emilie, please.
It's a great question. Thanks for bringing this up. So I think what's really important to understand is the types of claims that were made in these cases. Whenever you're wanting to make a claim and you're using the PEF framework or the ISO framework, you will need to have some product specific information included. So it's exactly what I was describing earlier. So for example, you'll need to have your full bill of material. You'll need to use information about the exact processes that you're using. You will need to use information that relates to your type of product for so distribution would be standard, but for the use phase or the end of life as well, and the number of times these things are used. In the cases that you're mentioning, people have used information about the material to make claims on a product. So there is, I guess, a step that was missed here, where people shouldn't have made claims about a material without actually seeing everything else that is included in the manufacturing of that garment and in the distribution and in the use phase of that garment. So it was a very, very simplistic approach as well. There was also no third-party review, and the PEF is asking for third-party review when making any communication on the footprint of your product. Now, there are obviously shortcomings to asking for verification every time, because that means we're probably never going to have enough verifiers to do this. So we need to find a way to streamline this. But the fact that you have to follow a standard set of rules, that you have to use some primary data, that you have to make sure that the claim you're making is actually about your product, not just about a material, and that everything is verified, is just another level of robustness compared to what we've seen, which I truly believe is people not really knowing what they're doing and wasn't intentional in any way. And that's what's tricky with LCN making sustainability claims, generally speaking, is that it is not as straightforward as we would like it to be, you know, from a marketing perspective. But we want to make sure that the science is sound and that there is a level of robustness to the work that we do. And as a side self-promotion note, and I wouldn't even have thought about it if it wasn't for your question, we published a guidance just 2 days ago about how to help companies make LCA-related claims. And I would encourage you to go see it. You can find it easily on our website, but it does go through this, you know, the claim that you're making, it should be science-based, it should be about your product, it should be about things that are actually relevant. If you're, you know, 0.01% better, can you really say that you're better? And it should be, yeah, really, really robust before you engage in any sort of communication activity. So I would say it's good that the consumer authorities are picking up these topics as well and are giving, I guess, hints as to the direction of travel for claims. But I haven't really seen anything, I guess, that would really turn LCA upside down. It is what's been recommended by the ISO standard and by the PEF method for years now.
And I think that was terrific. I guess we touched really upon all the big elephants. I would like to ask you to join me in an applause to Emilie, which has been grilled for 45 minutes. Regretfully, you were not with us today. I think perhaps this is a conversation that should continue in the next event. So thanks again. Thank you very much for your ability. And for all the colleagues in the room, please let's just go with the other colleagues in the next room so that we go for the final session of today. Thank you very much, everybody.